Today's scripture, Matthew 2, 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their country by another road.
And let us pray together. Illuminating God, by the power of your Holy Spirit, reveal to us through the reading of these words, your word became flesh, living among us, full of grace and truth. Amen. So what was on your Christmas list this year? Did you get everything that you wanted for Christmas? Are you totally fulfilled and happy? In our sermon series, All I Want for Christmas, we've been thinking not about the gifts that you've found under your tree, but about the gifts that Christ brings us. Advent is all about the longing that we have for the future. It's about the gifts of light and hope and peace and joy and love. And at Christmas, the gift of God's presence with us. But even though Christ brings us those gifts, our wants are not going to be instantly fulfilled. We continue to wait, knowing that Christmas started to change things, but the total fulfillment is in the future. But as we begin to receive those gifts, though, we don't remain the same. We're changed. We find ourselves acting differently. We have a changed understanding. We're new creations. We find that we've been given the gift of new life. Our wait now is different. Our wait is with Christ. We lean into the promise that God is making all things new. So we need to start practicing it, living like we've been made new. Like the wise men, we should leave Christmas by a different or a new route. As theologian Howard Thurman famously said, "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart." So what are you going to do differently with this new life that you've got? What New Year's resolutions will you make? What are you going to read this year? How are you going to pray this year? How are you going to worship? What are you going to do? Who are you going to serve? James Moore in his book, All I Want for Christmas, uses 3 illustrations for how our lives can change when we receive new ways of understanding. And I'm going to share those 3 ways with you this morning. So first, Christmas gives us a new picture of God. God in the flesh, who comes down to be with us and shows us how to live. You know, sometimes the picture we're given by others as they interpret parts of the Bible is one of a judgmental, vengeful, angry God. Through the Christmas story, we experience God's compassion, God's tenderness, and willingness to come to us as an innocent baby who will grow up and show us the way. Christ's birth enables us to form a new relationship with God, based not on fear, but on love. James Moore tells this story of his childhood. He said he was 9 at the time in Memphis, Tennessee, living with an 11-year-old brother and a 3-year-old sister. And they had a neighbour who they called Mr. Toby. He was an older man with long grey hair, a shaggy beard, who wore dirty overalls, dusty boots, and a grey sweat-stained hat. And Mr. Toby lived like a hermit, but he bought his groceries at the Moore's family grocery store. But James and his siblings were afraid of Mr. Toby, and they would hide when they saw him coming. And James said, had nightmares about him. One day, though, James and his siblings were playing in the front yard when their cat was hit by a car. And his back leg was hurt, and he came limping back into the yard. And the children gathered round their cat, crying, not knowing what to do. And they saw a pair of dusty feet. Mr. Toby was there, and he picked up the cat, hugged it, petted it, and then started to bark out orders and had them running to get a towel and tape and popsicle sticks. And Mr. Toby splinted the cat's leg and wrapped him in the towel with compassion and took him in their house and placed him in the cat's bed. And then Mr. Toby told him he knew a bit about cats and that their cat would be fine. And from that day onward, James and his siblings were no longer afraid of Mr. Toby, and they became great friends. The experience helped them to see Mr. Toby as he really was. How often do we have more compassion and more love when we really get to know another person? It's easy to draw a line in the sand and make assumptions about other people or even whole groups of people until you make a friend and listen to their story. And so if you want to understand about LGBTQ people, go and listen to Sam. If you want to understand about disabilities and health concerns, listen to Kathy. If you want to understand the homeless, talk to Sarah and Libby. If you want to understand aging, talk to some of our 90-year-olds. If you want to understand autism, listen to AJ. If you want to understand living with Down syndrome, talk to Carla and Justin. I know that I've been touched by each of their stories. Former President Barack Obama, in an interview with Prince Harry this week, said the truth is, on the internet, everything is simplified. But when you meet people face to face, it turns out it's complicated. He added that it's then possible to find surprising areas of common ground. May we find new life for ourselves and the stories and experiences of our neighbours and loved ones. Second way, point about new understanding. In other people, we can also see a reflection of God. James Moore talks about this story. It was written back in 1895 by Henry Van Dyke, and it's called The Story of the Other Wise Men. I'm sure some of you know this story. It's a story of a fourth wise man called Artaban, who set out to follow the star, taking with him 3 priceless gifts: a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl. Well, Artaban was riding to meet up at a pre-arranged place with his 3 friends, and they were going to leave without him if he was late. Well, suddenly Artaban saw a figure lying on the ground. It was a traveller struck with fever. If he stopped to help, he was going to miss the meet-up with his friends. Well, he did. He stopped and he helped, and he missed the caravan. So now he needed his own camel and bearers so he could make the journey on his own. He had to sell his sapphire to make this happen. And he was sad because the King of Kings would never get the sapphire. Well, by the time he managed to get to Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus had already left to flee to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre. Artaban was in a house in Bethlehem, though, where there was a child. And the soldiers came to the door. Artaban bribed them to go away with his ruby. He was sad now because the King of Kings would never get the ruby. For years and years, Artaban wandered, looking in vain for the King of Kings. More than 30 years passed, and Artaban was in Jerusalem when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was going to be crucified. The fourth wise man instinctively knew that this was the one that he had been looking for. And Artaban hurried toward Golgotha. Maybe his precious pearl could buy the life of the king. But he came upon a young girl, running from a band of soldiers. She cried to him, "Help me, my father is in debt and they're taking me to be sold as a slave to pay for his debt." Artaban hesitated, and then he took out his pearl and he gave it to the soldiers to buy the girl's freedom. Now his last gift for the king was gone. Suddenly there was an earthquake, and Artaban was critically injured by the flying debris. As he lay dying, he heard a whisper. "I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me." And Artaban died with a smile on his face because he knew the king had received his gifts. When we look at others, we are looking at God. The best way to serve God is to love God's children. May we find new life for ourselves by loving and giving to others. Third way of new life. When we experience good news, the first thing we want to do is to pass it on. And sometimes if it's not our news, we have to wait until we get permission to tell it. But as soon as you get that go ahead, it just bubbles up inside of you and you want to tell the world. Our faith should be like that too. James Moore tells this story about the origin of tinsel. I didn't know this one. It comes from a legend in a book by William Barclay. The legend goes like this. As Joseph, Mary and Jesus were escaping to Egypt, evening came and they were tired, and they sought refuge in a cave. It was cold. The ground was covered in frost. And a spider saw the Christ child and wished he could do something to help. He spun a web across the entrance to the cave to make a kind of curtain in the hopes that it might keep out some of the cold air. Well, later that night, some of Herod's soldiers came to the cave, and they were about to enter it when the captain saw the intact spider's web and reasoned that there couldn't be anyone inside, and so they passed on by, all because a little spider had spun a web of love. And that, they say, is why we hang tinsel up at Christmas time. The glittering tinsel streamers stand for the spider's web stretched across the entrance of the cave on the way to Egypt. The spider had spun his web with a new purpose, not to trap food, but to provide warmth. He had a new understanding of how he might use the gifts that he had in the service of God. How can you use your gifts with a new purpose in service to God? We're called to use our gifts to bring life rather than death, to bring love, not hate. We're not called to worship Herod and the things he stands for. We're called to let the God of love rule in our hearts. And like the wise men who fell to their knees and honoured the baby, we too are to kneel before him and offer our gifts. We're called to be transformed, to be new creations, to have new life. In the words of the song we sang earlier, what I can, I give him. Give my heart. All I want for Christmas is new life. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.